You lied about everything in your letter, Mountain Man Rancher told his obese mail-order bride. You lied about everything in your letter. Garrett Sterling's voice cut through the steam and clatter of the small Montana depot like the crack of a whip. Heads turned. A couple of cowhands lounging near the freight platform straightened, smirking. The station master paused with his ledger halfway closed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The woman standing in front of Garrett flinched as if he had struck her. She was not the tall, willowy blonde from the photograph folded in his pocket. This woman was shorter by a good hand, her frame soft and heavy under the faded traveling dress that pulled tight across her middle. The hat on her head had seen too many miles, the brim wilted from rain and dust. Strands of dark brown hair clung damply to her flushed cheeks. Her eyes, wide and frightened, were the deep, serious brown of a doe cornered in a ravine. I know, she whispered, fingers clutching the handle of her battered valise until her knuckles blanched. Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry. Please, let me explain. He pulled the photograph from his pocket and held it up between them. The girl in the picture was all light and angles, golden hair piled neatly, a narrow waist, a chin lifted with confident charm. Beneath the portrait, in looping ink, was the name she had signed so carefully, Lily Rose. Garrett's jaw flexed. Weeks of reading and rereading her letters, of imagining this woman walking through the door of his mountain ranch, of planning meals, rooms, even a new dress ordered from the catalog. Every quiet hope turned to sour ash in his mouth. You said you were 5'7", he said, his voice low but hard as river rock. You said you weighed barely 110. You said you were fair-haired, blue-eyed. You lied about all of it. He let his gaze sweep over her, not cruelly, but without mercy. Was any word in those letters true? Her eyes flooded. She glanced around at the small knot of onlookers. 2 ranch hands, a pair of giggling girls with hat boxes, an old miner spitting tobacco into the dust. She could feel their eyes crawling over her, measuring, comparing, mocking. My name is True, she choked out. My need was true. The rest, her voice broke, the rest was fear. If I had told you the truth, you would have burned my letters. A coarsely dressed man near the freight wagon chuckled under his breath. Can't blame him, he muttered to his friend. Man pays for a prize mare and gets a draft horse instead. The laughter that followed was low but sharp. The woman's shoulders hunched as if she could make herself smaller, disappear into the planks beneath her boots. Shame burned up her neck, prickling hot behind her ears. Garrett shot the men a warning look, and the laughter died, but the words hung in the chilly spring air. What is your real name? He asked. She swallowed hard. Florence Daisy Harper. Lily Rose is my middle name. It sounded prettier on paper. She lifted her chin a fraction, her voice trembling but determined. I can cook, I can sew, I can clean and care for stock. I worked from dawn to dark on my father's place back east. Those things were true. I just borrowed my sister's picture. If you'd seen what I really looked like, you never would have written back. Somewhere down the line, a locomotive wailed, long and lonely, echoing off the snow-capped ridges. The wind swept a flurry of fine dust along the platform, tugging at Garrett's worn trail coat, at the hem of Florence's skirt. He could send her back. He could put her on the next train east, wash his hands of the whole sorry mess, pretend the letters had never existed. But the way she stood there, shaking, humiliated in front of strangers, yet refusing to lie any further, stirred something deep in him that had nothing to do with photographs or measurements. Garrett closed his fingers slowly around the picture, then folded it once, twice, until the smiling golden girl disappeared. "You lied about everything in your letter," he repeated, softer this time. "But you still came." She nodded, tears spilling over. "I had nowhere else to go." For a long heartbeat, the only sound was the creak of wagon harness and the distant clank of metal on metal. Then Garrett reached down, lifted her heavy valise as if it weighed nothing, and jerked his head toward the road leading up into the mountains. "Get in the wagon, Miss Harper," he said. "You're not my wife, not yet, but you're not sleeping in this depot either." Florence stared at him stunned, a fragile thread of hope weaving through her fear. He didn't look back at her. "Last call," he added gruffly. "The mountains don't wait for anyone." She drew a shaking breath, gathered her skirts, and stepped off the platform toward the man who had every right to send her away and hadn't. The wagon rattled along the rough trail that wound upward through the foothills, the sun drifting lower behind the ridges until the whole world seemed carved from bronze and shadow. Florence sat stiffly on the wooden seat beside Garrett, hands folded tight in her lap, trying not to jostle him, trying not to take up more space than she already did. Each bump in the trail sent her swaying, and she steadied herself with a small gasp, embarrassed every time her shoulder brushed his arm. Garrett kept his eyes on the road. He held the reins with the practiced ease of a man who had driven through blizzards and spring floods, through night and fog and mountain storms. His silence pressed on her more than his anger had at the station. She kept stealing glances at him, unable to stop herself. His profile was all strong planes and tired lines, the kind of handsomeness forged by wind and work rather than any softness. She could see where the sun had browned his skin, where the stubble shadowed his jaw, where tension pulled the corners of his mouth tight. This was not the life of the gentleman her mother once hoped she would marry. This was a man who carried the weight of an entire ranch on his shoulders. Far below them, the small depot town had disappeared into the dust. Ahead, the mountains rose in blue-gray layers, their peaks still capped with winter snow. Pines thickened as they climbed, the air cooling, scented with sap and earth. A river glittered through the valley like a knife blade catching light. Florence shivered, unsure whether from cold or fear. Nothing about this land felt gentle. Garrett noticed. Without a word, he reached behind the seat, pulled out a folded wool blanket, and dropped it across her lap. She murmured a quiet, "Thank you." He only nodded, his gaze already fixed forward again. She studied her hands. She had scrubbed them raw before leaving home, hoping they would look softer, more ladylike. But the calluses remained, reminders of years spent hauling water, scrubbing floors, mending torn shirts for a father who never thanked her, and a sister she had tried desperately to protect. Letters had been the only part of her life that felt dreamlike, the only place she could pretend, just for a few pages, that she might be wanted somewhere, by someone. Now that dream had hardened into this road, this man, these mountains. As the trail curved along a ridge, the ranch came into view. Silver Creek Ranch sprawled across the valley floor, a cluster of sturdy outbuildings, long cattle pens stretching toward the river, and a 2-story log house with smoke rising from its chimney. Light glimmered from the windows, warm and golden against the evening shadows. Garrett slowed the wagon, letting her take it in. "That's your home for now," he said quietly. Florence's breath caught. It was larger than she expected, grand in a rugged way, a place built for work, not comfort. She wondered if there was any corner inside where she would belong. As they drove into the yard, half a dozen cowhands emerged from the bunkhouse, dust-covered and sweat-streaked from the day's work. They paused when they saw her. Their eyes traveled over her figure with open curiosity, then exchanged glances that made heat crawl up her neck. One man chuckled under his breath. Another nudged his friend and whispered something she couldn't hear, but understood all the same. Garrett swung down from the wagon, his boots thudding on the packed earth. "That's enough," he said, his voice cutting through the whispers. The men stiffened. "Show some respect." The cowhands muttered apologies and drifted back to their chores, but Florence had already seen their smirks. She wished she could shrink into herself, become invisible among the dust and shadows. Garrett held out his hand to help her down. She hesitated, ashamed of how much effort it took for her to climb out gracefully. But he didn't rush her. He kept his hand steady until her feet touched the ground. Inside the house, she found a world that smelled of cedar, smoke, and long days. The main room was wide, walls lined with shelves of tools and spare equipment, maps pinned near the table, a rifle resting above the hearth. This was a working man's home, built for survival, not beauty, and yet something about it felt alive, steady, warm, honest. Garrett gestured toward a small room near the rear of the house. "You'll sleep here. I'll show you the kitchen in the morning. You'll be up at 4 to cook for the men and myself." He kept his tone neutral, but she sensed effort beneath it, as if he was trying not to let frustration edge into his words. "If you work hard, you'll earn your place here." Florence clasped her hands at her waist. "I will, I promise." He looked at her a long moment, not cruelly, not kindly, measuring. Then he nodded, tipped his hat slightly, and stepped back toward the door. "Rest while you can. This land doesn't forgive the unprepared." The door closed behind him, leaving her in the small, plain room with only her breath for company. Outside, she could hear the distant lowing of cattle, the metallic ring of someone hammering a loose hinge, the murmur of male voices drifting on the cooling air. This was her second chance, her last chance. She set her battered valise on the floor, pressed a trembling hand to her heart, and prayed she would be strong enough for the life that awaited her here. The next morning began long before sunrise. A faint gray shimmer edged the horizon, while the rest of the world still slept beneath a blanket of cold spring darkness. Florence woke to the creaking of the house, settling in the chill, her breath a faint cloud in the air. She fumbled into her dress, fingers stiff, and stepped quietly into the hallway. From somewhere outside came the low rumble of cattle shifting in their pens, the soft crunch of boots in dirt, and the murmur of men preparing for the day. In the kitchen, she found Garrett already awake. He stood near the stove, lighting the fire with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of years spent alone. His hair was damp from the pump out back, the ends darkening his collar. He didn't look up at first, but when he finally turned, she saw a faint surprise in his eyes. She had expected him to wake her, but instead she had beaten the sun. "You're early," he said simply. "I thought it best to begin before the men came in." He nodded once. No praise, no encouragement, but something eased in his posture as he stepped aside to give her room at the stove. She moved carefully, still learning the rhythm of the kitchen, but she worked with quiet determination. She sliced bread, stirred eggs, fried potatoes in the heavy iron skillet. Cooking for 11 hungry ranch hands was unlike anything she'd done at home, but she kept her head down and focused on each task until the room filled with the scent of butter and smoke. Garrett watched her only when he thought she wasn't looking, noticing how she bit her lip when concentrating, how she used her whole body to lift the heavy pot, how she wiped her hands on her apron between every step, nervous but steady. There was something earnest about her, something that softened the sharpness of yesterday's disappointment. When the men filed in, loud and dusty even at dawn, Garrett's presence kept them civil. They ate quickly, shoveling food onto their plates with greedy relief, though a few shot her sideways glances as if still deciding what to make of her. She didn't hold their gaze. Instead, she focused on the stove, listening to the scrape of forks and the low hum of voices. After breakfast, Garrett saddled 2 horses. Florence blinked in confusion when he returned to the porch holding the reins of a gentle bay mare. "This one's for you," he said. "You'll need to know the land." Her stomach tightened. "I've only ridden a few times." "That's enough. Silver Creek Ranch covers nearly 10,000 acres. If you're to live here, you'll have to learn its bones." He helped her into the saddle, his hand steady on her waist, warm even through the fabric of her dress. She felt heat rise to her cheeks as he guided her foot into the stirrup. Once she was balanced, he mounted his own horse, a tall, dapple gray gelding that seemed an extension of him. Without another word, they rode out toward the open valley. The air was sharper away from the house, touched with pine and the distant promise of lingering winter. As they followed the narrow trail, the ranch stretched out below them, a patchwork of pastures, streams cutting silver threads through the grass, distant cattle moving like dark smudges across the land. The mountains rose on every side, their peaks wrapped in cloud. It was a world so vast she felt swallowed by it, yet strangely awakened at the same time. Garrett kept the pace steady, letting her adjust to the movement of the mare. For the first few minutes, Florence rode stiffly, every muscle clenched with worry. But gradually, the sway of the horse, the rhythm of hooves against earth, the crisp morning air filling her chest, they loosened something inside her. She sat straighter, her hands steadied. He noticed. "Good," he said quietly. They rode along a ridge that opened onto a view so wide it seemed to touch the edge of the earth. Florence stared in awe. Back east, the world had always been cramped. Narrow rooms, narrow expectations, narrow futures. Here, everything was open, raw, untamed. "This land is harsh," Garrett said, as if reading her thoughts. "It doesn't give anything for free. You earn every meal, every quiet night, every sunrise." She glanced at him, his profile cut against the pale sky. "And yet, you stay." "I stay because it's worth it," he replied. "Some things only grow where life tests you." She didn't know if he meant the cattle, the ranch, or himself. They reached the upper creek, where meltwater rushed down from the mountains, white and fast. The horses drank while Florence crouched near the bank, letting the icy spray cool her fingers. Garrett stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the water with a distant expression. "Why did you really come here?" he asked suddenly. She froze. The truth lay heavy on her tongue, tangled with shame. "Because I needed a place where I wasn't a burden, a place where I might matter." Garrett turned toward her slowly. "Everyone matters somewhere." "But do they matter here?" she whispered. His gaze held hers for a long moment, steady, unflinching, something unreadable flickering behind it. Then he spoke, his voice rough but sincere. "That depends on what they choose to become." He mounted his horse again and held out his hand to help her up. She took it, the warmth of his grip grounding her more than the saddle beneath her. The ride back was quieter, but not uncomfortable. A different silence settled between them, not the cold distance of strangers, but something fragile and new, shaped by shared air, shared ground, and the first threads of understanding. By the time the ranch came into view again, the morning sun had risen fully over the peaks, lighting the valley in gold. Florence felt something shift inside her, small, tentative, but real. For the first time since arriving, she wondered if she might carve out a place here after all. Spring on the Montana frontier was a season that never quite made up its mind. Some mornings broke warm and soft, the kind that carried the smell of thawing earth and the promise of new grass. Other mornings arrived with snowflakes drifting heavy and stubborn, clinging to fence rails and the black manes of restless horses. The ranch lived by these shifts. So did Garrett Sterling, but Florence Harper learned it differently. Her world shrank to the cabin walls and all the work that filled the space between dawn and dark. She woke before the men stirred, feeling her way through the dim kitchen while the fire still slept. She coaxed the stove to life, built the warmth from nothing but kindling, breath, and patience. She washed dishes until her hands ached, learned the rhythm of kneading bread that would rise properly in the dry mountain air, learned how much coffee 11 men could drink before mid-morning. She swept dust that returned the next hour, patched shirts missing half their seams, scrubbed floors that bore more boot prints than she could keep up with. But slowly, almost without noticing, she settled into the cabin, the way a tired bird settles into a long-needed perch. Everything inside the house seemed to make room for her, as if it had been waiting for someone who knew how to warm a place simply by caring for it. And Garrett noticed, even if he never said much. He spent long days in the saddle, checking fences, driving cattle to higher pasture, bringing down strays from the timberline. Yet whenever he stepped through the door in the evenings, shaking off the cold and dust, something softened in his shoulders. He didn't speak it aloud, but Florence knew what the change meant. A house feels different when someone is tending its quiet corners. One afternoon, a late storm rolled across the mountains, heavy as iron. The wind struck the cabin hard enough to rattle the shutters. Florence had been struggling to bring in the wash before the rain drowned it, but the gusts kept whipping the sheets out of her hands. Garrett appeared without warning, one rough hand gripping the clothesline, the other gathering the wet fabric with her. "You don't need to fight the wind alone," he said. She hadn't even heard him ride in. He seemed always to move silently, like someone raised by the mountains themselves. Together, they pulled the wash inside, dripping but salvageable. Her hair clung damply to her forehead. She pushed it back, embarrassed at how flustered she must look. Garrett set the basket down and reached for a towel, handing it to her without ceremony. "Storm'll get worse before supper," he said. "Stay inside after this." She nodded, grateful for the towel, grateful he hadn't commented on how the wind had nearly knocked her off her feet. He lingered a moment, watching the sheets sway from the rafters where she'd hung them. Then he turned away, but not before she caught something gentle flicker across his expression. Later that evening, As the storm hammered the cabin with relentless force, Garrett repaired the loose latch on the kitchen window. Wet snow blew sideways against the glass, the world beyond nothing but white fury. Florence watched him work by lamplight. His hands were strong and scarred, the nails often cracked from cold, but they handled the tools with an unexpected care. When he finished, he ran a thumb along the edge of the frame to ensure it sealed properly. "I don't want the wind getting in," he said. Florence didn't know if he meant the literal wind or the kind of cold that seeped into a person's bones when they felt alone. Either way, she felt warmed by the thought. As days passed, the rhythm between them grew steadier. In the mornings, he'd return from the barn with 2 logs tucked under one arm, dropping them beside the stove with a quiet, "Fire'll burn longer with these." Sometimes, before riding out, he left a small tin of berry preserves on the counter, the kind he'd traded for in town, knowing she liked them with her bread. They weren't gifts, not really. They were gestures, simple as rain, but they gathered inside her like something sacred. There were evenings when the men came in late from the range, cold and irritable. They'd grumble about the wind, or the long ride, or the stubborn cattle. Florence learned that a bowl of hot stew could tame nearly any temper, and that the men's voices softened when they forgot she was listening. Some still didn't know what to make of her, but the sharp looks faded. She had earned her place with each plate she set before them, with every quiet task she completed without complaint. One night, Garrett returned after sundown, soaked to the bone from driving strays out of a ravine. Florence rushed to set a pot of water near the stove, her hands moving before she could think. He stood near the fire, dripping onto the floor, teeth clenched as the heat touched his frozen skin. "You'll catch your death like that," she murmured before she could stop herself. He glanced at her, surprise flickering at being fussed over. Instead of brushing her off, he accepted the dry shirt she offered. Turning away only slightly, he stripped the wet one off. She kept her eyes fixed on the floorboards, yet still saw the outline of his back. Broad shoulders, the curve of muscle from years of labor, the pale scar that cut across his ribs like a mark left by an old regret. "Thank you," he said quietly when he had changed. The storm outside softened to a whisper. They stood near the stove, the firelight casting their shadows against the wall. Something unspoken drifted between them, something warmer than the fire, something that made her heart tremble in her chest. Garrett cleared his throat, as if steadying himself. "You've made this place different," he said. "It feels less empty." Florence's breath caught. She had not realized how desperately she needed to hear words like that. Not flattery, not polite praise, but something honest from a man who rarely offered anything he didn't mean. She swallowed hard, afraid of saying the wrong thing. "I'm glad," she whispered. "I only hope to be useful." "You're more than that." His voice was low, almost rough. "You've steadied the men. You've steadied me." The room seemed to still. The fire crackled. Snow tapped softly at the window. She felt the weight of his gaze before she dared to lift her eyes. That night, long after he'd gone upstairs and the house had grown quiet, she lay awake in her small room. She stared at the ceiling, the faint glow of dying embers flickering through the crack under her door. For the first time since arriving, she wasn't thinking about what she'd lied about. She wasn't thinking about how the men had stared at her. She wasn't thinking about the fear that had followed her like a shadow. Instead, she was thinking about the way Garrett had said, you've steadied me." She fell asleep with warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. By midsummer, the mountains had shed their last traces of snow, and the grass on the far pastures rose nearly to a horse's belly. Silver Creek Ranch moved with the steady rhythm of the season, long rides to the high meadows, branding calves in the heat, repairing fences beaten by winter storms. The days stretched wide and bright, yet something heavier began to settle in the air around the cabin, as if the land itself sensed a shift coming. Florence felt it first. Small things began to go wrong, little disruptions that carried the weight of intention. A hinge she had mended fell apart again the next morning. A window latch she swore she had secured was found swinging open in the wind. A batch of bread dough she set to rise was knocked from the table when she stepped outside to bring in water. Nothing large, nothing violent, just enough to stir unease. Garrett noticed her worry and asked once, but when she shook her head, he let the matter rest. He wasn't the kind of man who pressed for confessions. He waited, observed, let truth rise the way heat rose from sun-baked earth. The truth came on a Sunday afternoon. The men had ridden into town for supplies, leaving the ranch unusually quiet. Florence was sweeping the porch when the sound of hooves broke the stillness. She expected one of the hands returning early, but the rider who appeared was no rancher. He was a sheriff from the eastern counties, wearing a badge dulled by dust and a face sharpened by miles. The horse beneath him was lathered, its sides streaked with sweat. He dismounted and tipped his hat, though his eyes held no courtesy. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm looking for a woman, goes by the name Florence Daisy Harper." Her breath vanished. The broom slipped from her hand and clattered against the porch boards. Before she could speak, Garrett stepped out from the barn, wiping oil from his fingers. His gaze hardened the moment he saw the stranger. "State your business." The sheriff didn't look away from Florence. "She's wanted back east. Her father filed claim on her. Says she fled his household without permission. Says she's got something belongs to him." Garrett moved to stand between them, taller, broader, his shadow falling over the sheriff like a warning. "What exactly is she supposed to have taken?" The lawman's lips tightened. "A deed. 50 acres of timberland left by her mother's family, valuable land. Her father says she stole it before she ran." Florence swallowed hard, heart hammering against her ribs. "It wasn't theft," she whispered. "My mother left that land to me. Her own hand wrote it. But my father, he wanted to sell it to pay his debts. When I refused to sign it over, he—" She broke off, her voice splintering. Years of fear pressed against her throat. "He meant to marry me off to a man old enough to be my grandfather. I ran before he could." Garrett's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his beard. He knew enough about hard men and hard lives to recognize truth when he heard it. He also knew what it meant for a woman to stand alone against a world that expected her to stay quiet no matter the cost. The sheriff's expression didn't soften. "She's under claim. I've been ordered to bring her back. Papers are in my saddlebag." Garrett stepped forward, blocking the porch stairs entirely. "No one takes her without speaking to me first." The sheriff raised a brow. "You her husband?" Garrett paused for a single breath, then answered with quiet finality. "She's under my protection." That was not a lie, even if it wasn't yet the whole truth. The sheriff's gaze flicked between them, weighing the risk. Garrett Sterling was a mountain of a man, the kind who didn't raise his voice because he never needed to. The kind who'd spent a lifetime dealing with threats far larger than a traveling officer with a dusty badge. "Let me see the papers," Garrett said. The sheriff hesitated, then turned toward his horse, and that was when Florence moved. "Stop." Her voice trembled, but she didn't let it falter. She stepped down from the porch, standing only a few feet behind Garrett. "I'll tell the truth of it. My father forged documents once. He'll do it again. He doesn't care what's lawful. He never did." She pulled a folded packet from her apron, worn, creased, protected like something priceless. "This is the deed. My mother's signature. The seal from the county court. He has been trying to take this from me since she died." Garrett didn't take it from her. He simply stood by her side, letting her speak, letting her stand. The sheriff studied the papers, his brows lowering as he looked over the seal and writing. At last he exhaled sharply. "This'll cause trouble. Your father's a loud man. He'll push the courts. If he can't get the law, he'll hire men willing to make their own rules." Garrett's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "They'll find nothing here except a woman who belongs where she chooses to stand." The sheriff closed the deed and handed it back to Florence. "For now, I can't take you," he admitted, "but he'll send someone less interested in paperwork next time." With that, he mounted his horse and rode off, dust rising behind him in a fading cloud. When the last echo of hooves disappeared, silence fell heavy on the ranch. Florence clutched the deed with shaking hands. Garrett turned toward her slowly, his expression unreadable. "You should have told me," he said quietly. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Of me?" She lifted her eyes to his. "No, of losing the only place where I've started to feel safe." The word struck him with more force than any storm. He stepped closer, carefully, as if approaching a startled bird. "You're not losing anything," he said. "Not while I'm here." A tremor passed through her, part relief, part something deeper. "He won't stop, Garrett. He never has. Then he'll learn what kind of man stands in his way." She stared at him, the truth settling warm and unfamiliar in her chest. This wasn't the tender hope she'd once written about in letters. This was something raw, solid, real, something earned. But the sheriff's warning echoed through the wind that evening as the sky reddened over the mountains. Trouble was coming, and it was headed straight for Silver Creek Ranch. The trouble arrived 3 days later, carried on the back of a storm that gathered over the peaks like a bruised fist. The sky had turned the color of cold iron, the wind restless, tugging at loose shingles and whispering warnings along the fence lines. Garrett felt the change before he saw anything. Years of living alone with the land had given him instincts sharper than most men's eyes. By noon, the ranch hands sensed it too. The cattle moved nervously. Horses in the barn stamped and tossed their heads. Florence felt the shift in the air while she kneaded dough at the kitchen table. Something heavy pressed against the windows, something that wasn't weather. Then came the hooves. 4 riders crested the ridge from the east, moving in a tight cluster, men who didn't come to trade, didn't come to talk. Their silhouettes were hard-edged against the storm clouds, their horses lathered and restless. No sheriff rode with them, only hired muscle with no patience for law. Florence froze when she saw them from the window. The dough slipped from her hands. She whispered Garrett's name as if summoning a shield. He was already on the porch. Garrett stepped out into the wind, the boards creaking under his boots. He didn't reach for the rifle resting just inside the doorway, not yet. He stood with his shoulders squared, his presence alone enough to make the ground feel steadier beneath her feet. The riders slowed as they neared the yard. Their leader, a man with sharp cheekbones and a scar slicing across his jaw, reined in at the porch steps, his voice carried with the storm. "We're looking for Florence Harper." Garrett didn't blink. "You found the wrong place." The scarred man smirked. "Her daddy says otherwise. Claims she stole something from him. Claims you're hiding her." Garrett's voice came low and even, like distant thunder. "I don't hide anyone, but no one here belongs to a man like him." One of the hired guns nudged his horse forward. "We ain't asking. Hand her over." Garrett stepped down from the porch, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The wind tore at his coat, but he walked with that slow, deliberate confidence that made lesser men second-guess themselves. He came to stand only a few feet from the riders, his eyes never leaving theirs. "Turn around," he said. "You're not taking her." Scarjaw chuckled, but there was a flicker, just a flicker, of respect in his eyes. "You're willing to fight over a woman who lied her way onto your land?" Garrett didn't look away. "I'm willing to fight for a woman who deserves to live free." Inside the cabin, Florence stepped into the doorway, drawn by something stronger than fear. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she stood tall, hands clenched at her sides. "This is my home," she said, her voice trembling but sure, "and I'm not going back." The scarred man studied her, an ugly grin forming. "You ain't got a choice, girl." Garrett shifted forward, blocking their view of her entirely. "She does now." Scarjaw's grin faded. The men on horseback reached for their guns. Garrett didn't move. He simply said, "You're outnumbered." For a heartbeat, the riders hesitated until they heard it. The ranch hands had emerged silently from the barn, rifles resting casually in their grip, forming a loose half-circle around the intruders. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They just stood the way men stand when they've chosen their side. Scarjaw swallowed hard, eyes narrowing as he recalculated. "This ain't over." "No," Garrett replied. "It's just the last time you'll try it." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rising through the cottonwoods, the distant rumble of thunder chasing down the mountains. Then the riders turned. Hooves thudded heavily against the earth as they retreated across the ridge, storm clouds closing behind them like a door. When the last of them disappeared into the haze, Garrett exhaled slowly and turned back toward the cabin. Florence was still in the doorway, tears trembling in her lashes, not from fear this time, but from something deeper, something that shook the ground beneath her more than the men who'd come to take her. Garrett stepped closer, his voice quiet. "You stood your ground. You didn't run." She met his gaze, her heart unsteady. "I wasn't standing alone." The wind softened. The storm held its breath. He lifted his hand, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch careful, reverent. "You're safe here," he murmured. "As long as I draw breath, nothing will take you from this place." It was not a promise made lightly. It was a vow carved from mountains and thunder, and Florence believed him. The storm rolled in fully that evening, sweeping over the valley like a great dark tide. Rain drummed on the roof in steady, deliberate strokes, and the wind pressed against the cabin walls with the low, constant groan of a restless giant. But inside, the world felt strangely still, quiet in a way that held both relief and something softer, more fragile. Garrett had fixed the latch on the back door before sunset, his hands working with calm focus, though Florence could see the tension lingering in his shoulders. He carried danger the way other men carried saddlebags, always ready, always aware. But tonight, something in him had eased. He had protected what mattered, and it showed in the gentleness of his movements. She stood by the hearth, turning the last of the day's coals with the iron poker, letting the heat breathe through the room. When Garrett finally stepped inside from his final check of the yard, he paused in the doorway, watching her with an expression she had not yet learned how to name. "You should rest," he said softly. She shook her head. "Not yet." He crossed the room, his boots muted on the wooden floorboards, and lowered himself into the chair near the fire. The lamplight brushed across his face, tracing the quiet strength in his features, the kind of strength not born of brute force, but of endurance, conviction, and the kind of patience few men possessed anymore. Florence sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire, the rain, and the slow settling of the house filled the silence between them like a familiar hymn. Garrett broke it first. "You were brave today," he murmured, "braver than most folks would have been in your place." She shook her head, not in denial, but in humility. "I was terrified." "Courage ain't the absence of fear," he replied. "It's choosing to stand anyway." Her eyes warmed, and she felt something inside her loosen, a knot she didn't realize she'd been carrying, woven from years of running, hiding, shrinking herself to fit whatever shape the world demanded. Here, in this cabin, with the storm outside and the fire inside, she felt seen in a way she hadn't known she longed for. "I never meant for my troubles to come here," she said quietly. "This place, it's the only peace I've ever known." Garrett leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Peace don't break that easy," he said, "and you're not a burden on this land or on me." Her breath hitched. The fire flickered brighter, as if leaning in to hear the next words. He hesitated, not from doubt, but from the weight of saying something true. "You've changed this house," he said. "I come in at the end of each day, and it feels warmer, like a place meant for more than just surviving." The rain eased a little, shifting from a roar to a steady whisper. Florence watched the flames dance across his face and knew that whatever lay between them now had grown from deeper soil than letters, hopes, or illusions. It had taken root in labor, danger, and choices made when no one else was watching. "Garrett," she whispered, "do you think—" He looked up at her, and she lost the rest of her words. She didn't need to finish. Garrett's voice lowered to something tender, almost reverent. "You're safe here, Florence. This can be your home, if you'll have it." Her eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. The fire crackled. The wind sighed against the eaves, and the moment settled between them like a quiet promise neither of them rushed to claim, because some truths grow stronger when given time. Outside, the storm rolled on toward the far hills. Inside, hope finally had room to breathe. Stories like this have a way of reminding us that the world is wide, yet hearts can find each other even in the loneliest corners of the mountains. If you're listening tonight, wherever you may be, know that your presence here means more than you realize. These old frontier tales travel far when folks like you carry them. Tell me, where are you listening from? What corner of the world holds your story? And if you still believe in a love that stands its ground, stay a little longer. The next journey is waiting for you.